Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the NEXTEUK Kickoff virtual conference. I'm Dr. Sarah Wolf. I'm a reader in European integration and international relations. And we are here today in this conference about the future of EU-UK relations. I'm the principal investigator, and you will meet also throughout the day my colleague Agathe Piquet, who is part of the management team, and also my multiple colleagues who are part of the expert team, such as Violeta today on the roundtable, and many others who have joined us, such as Stella Ladi, Paul Copland, Stein, Van Kessel, and so on. This is the second and final half day. And over these 2 half days, we have had 2 roundtables, 4 rounds of parallel sessions involving more than 50 speakers and discussants on topics ranging from Article 50 and how to reform it to the role of national and the European Parliament in Brexit. So I would like to thank all the speakers who are based in the audience, who are based all around Europe and beyond. We will have people joining from the US as well. And I thank them for being here today. I think so far we have had about 170 people in the audience. So thanks for joining us. And we have a wide range of speakers and participants in the audience coming from academia, but also beyond, with people from the private sector, from think tanks, from civil society. And I think this will be reflected also in this roundtable today. But before I introduce the roundtable, I would like also to introduce the project. So NEXTEUK is about the future of EU-UK relations. You can follow us by subscribing to our newsletter, where you will be up to date with our activities. This is our biggest conference, our first annual conference, but we will also have PhD summer school, a virtual seminar series. Given the current pandemic, that's the way to go. During the PhD summer school, we will have also mobility grants for early career scholars and PhD students. So please just follow our social media accounts and our website to stay up to date. We're going now to move to the roundtable. So the title we chose, which was about 6 months ago, was Turbulent Times for the Freedom of Movement in Europe. We were thinking we were going to speak only about Brexit, but we added the pandemic dimension as in the UK. But of course, the pandemic makes it even harder, with quarantine, with lockdowns all over Europe, or in most of Europe. So I'm really glad that we're able to have this roundtable today. And before introducing the speakers and the discussants, I have to remind the speakers that I will be a fierce timekeeper. And if a speaker is running over time, so over 5 minutes, I will wave this red piece of paper as a signal so that they can finish very quickly. And otherwise, I might have to cut you at some point. So forgive me for that, but it's for the sake of fairness. And to keep time for interaction with our audience, we will have also a Q&A. And when I will ask the audience, they will be able to type in their questions in the chat. So we have quite a full roundtable today. I will introduce each of the speakers, and then they will all be able to give their perspective on what's the state of freedom of movement, I think, for citizens, for migrants, for asylum seekers, but also we will have a perspective, I think, on when it comes to also freedom of goods, which has been also interrupted. So I will start with Claude Moraes. You're from the British Labour Party, and you were a member of the European Parliament from 1999 until 2020. So yeah, until recently. And you've chaired most of your work is known as a chair of the Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs committees. And I think one of your latest work at the European Parliament was to oversee the adoption of the mandate of the European Public Prosecutor Office, which fights corruption. I'm also very glad to welcome to this roundtable Dr. Violeta Moreno-Lax. She's a reader in law. She's my colleague at Queen Mary University. She has founded the Immigration Law Program at Queen Mary, and she's also visiting professor at the College of Europe and founder and general coordinator of SAROB Med, which is the Search and Rescue Observatory for the Mediterranean. And I'm sure you will have something to say also about recent crossings in the channel. Susan Oberhauser, welcome. You are the head of the European Parliament Liaison Office in the UK, and we're very happy to have you as a partner also during the 2 days of the conference. And your colleague has already kindly agreed to be there for our coffee break and to share his views and to share a presentation about the role of the Parliament after Brexit in the UK. Then we have Nicole Sykes. Welcome as well. You are part of our International Advisory Board, so I'm really glad to have you on this roundtable. And you are currently Director of External Affairs at Pro Bono Economics, but you were until recently leading the EU negotiations for the Conference of British Industry, where you led, of course, all the work on Brexit. Our two discussants are academics. I'm very happy to welcome Sabine Saureguer. She's the Director of Sciences Po Grenoble in France and Professor of Political Science. She has extensively written about European integration theories and judicial actors. Valsalmi Smitsilegas is Professor of European Criminal Law and Global Security and Deputy Dean for Global Engagement at Europe at Queen Mary University of London. Is also a very good colleague. So I think I will now leave the floor to Claude. I think given your extensive experience on justice and home affairs, Schengen, I'm sure you will be able to share your perspective on what is currently happening in terms of freedom of movement in Europe. The floor is yours, Claude.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. And you can hear me okay? Good. Yeah, so I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to just give a snapshot of what I think is happening with COVID, really, because COVID throws into sharp relief many issues which were already problematic in the European Union in this area. Schengen, which had not been reformed, and Schengen and free movement, which had not been reformed. The issue of Brexit and free movement, which had already been uncertain, even before the recent events we've seen with the British government and their manoeuvres on the bill. And also the issue of asylum and immigration, where the reform on the Asylum and Migration Pact, which we were going to see this year, still has not happened. So all of these very big reforms were happening and COVID happened. So I think it's really important to understand that COVID has now thrown these issues into sharp relief, and it's very important to see them through that kind of paradigm. First of all, Schengen, it was already a source of tension because many member states, to put it in very simple terms, were adopting a kind of security mandate. They were using the 6-month regulation. They were adopting a kind of chain 6-month closure of internal borders. And I was on the committee which was overseeing this from the European Parliament to try and preserve what was really free movement. And I think this is where the Commission was. So it's interesting to see that member states were trying to move towards a more security-based Schengen restriction. Of course, the minute COVID happened, we see the health-based movement towards the closure of internal borders. It's interesting to see what happened in February when Italy tried to close its internal borders and it was rejected by the Commission. Of course, by March, 15 member states had to close internal borders, and we see those member states and the additional Schengen members closing internal borders. By April, of course, we saw the EU acting on cross-border movements of critical workers, and we saw the EU civil protection mechanism working quite well. So the widely shared view that the EU failed in this area is not quite right, but we saw free movement happening, but clearly there were real compromises. And today we see the EU and Schengen being a very mixed picture. We see member states, when it comes to permissible domestic and international mobility, having very different criteria and having that mixed picture. And the problem is that the Schengen zone and free movement in the Schengen zone could become entrenched following COVID, or problems with free movement in the Schengen zone could become entrenched. We see the old conflicts because we don't have the reform to the Schengen regulation, which was promised. And that is a big issue, and that's one that we should really discuss. And then we come to the issue of asylum and immigration, because on the external border, we've had this debate since 2015, which is of course linked to Schengen. And we saw, for example, Italy and Malta declaring in March through COVID that ports couldn't be safe to disembark asylum seekers because of COVID. But of course, they would then go to Libya, which of course is not safe because of COVID and the massive militarization of what is happening in Libya. Violetta will talk more about this, no doubt. But this is a real problem for the European Union, because throughout COVID, it's only exacerbating many of those issues for asylum and migration. Then it comes, of course, to Brexit. And I'm, of course, just summarising deals. Violetta will talk about this across the channel. But for EU citizens in the United Kingdom, it's just bringing more uncertainty. We're now facing potential no deal. That is one issue. But we're also facing uncertainty even if there was a deal, because the idea of what kind of deal we will now get and the safety of that deal is now thrown again into some doubt because of the potential breaching of treaty obligations. And for British citizens in the European Union, that is also a concern because of free movement concerns around Schengen and what is being promised to British citizens in the European Union. So I think these three issues, Schengen and free movement and the way that the Schengen regulation is or is not going to be reformed, asylum and migration and the way that is linked to Schengen, and of course Brexit and free movement, which is now so much more uncertain with the way the UK government is acting, and also in the way that free movement is much more compromised through COVID, I think are the three issues that are central to this debate as we see COVID. But I just want to say a couple of positive things as I end. One is that we've seen the huge positive contribution of migrant workers through COVID. They are necessary, they are needed. If we can see some of those positive aspects, that would be a great thing to see. On the negative side, of course, we may see an entrenchment of introspection, isolationism, and nationalism in the months to come, and that would be very negative. So there are some positives that we could see through this crisis in this area, but of course there are real negatives and real dangers ahead too.
Thank you very much. You're just on time. Thank you so much. And I think you've just summarized very brilliantly the situation, working myself on Schengen. Violetta, I'm turning now to you. I'm sure you have a lot also to say following Claude's reaction. And of course, you have worked also, I mean, your expertise is on migration and search and rescue. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm actually going to be speaking about the impact of Brexit and pandemic politics on channel crossings, because I think it's interesting to see how both have been used as an excuse to toughen the stance against asylum seekers. And to give you some context, the UK hosts a tiny fraction of the global refugee population and receives far less asylum applications than many other countries in the EU. So of the 30 million refugees worldwide, according to UNHCR, the UK hosts a mere 20,000, And these are government figures up to March 2020. In 2019, there were about 36,000 asylum applications in the UK. And you need to compare this with the more than 160,000 in Germany, more than 151,000 in France, or more than 120,000 in Spain during the same period. So there are three trends that I wanted to highlight against this background, which I think are worth highlighting. So the first is the overall number of refugees and asylum applicants in the UK, which is decreasing, and COVID has played a part in this trend. The overall trend, as I was saying, is downwards when looking at the statistics from the past decade. So, and there's been higher numbers this year compared to 2019, but the overall trend is downwards, as I was saying. And this trend appears to be consolidating through the effect of COVID, which seems to be exacerbating this trend. The second trend is that COVID measures are making travel to the UK more difficult. So channel crossings are on the rise, and we've seen the headlines throughout the summer, due to tougher controls at ports and airports because of COVID. COVID controls have had the effect of pushing irregular journeys onto more dangerous routes, because without options left to enter legally through, for example, humanitarian resettlement programs or other means, asylum applicants are left with smuggling as the only option to reach the UK and seek asylum. Traditionally, transport for them was organized in lorries, but with increased controls because of COVID, there's been a shift to the much more dangerous sea route across the channel, at least for the 4,000 people who have been detected and apprehended upon arrival. And again, this number is tiny when compared to the tenfold, 14,000 sea arrivals in Italy, or the 10,000 in Spain, or the 8,000 in Greece over the same period. And in any event, it remains a small fraction of the 36 asylum seekers who arrived in the UK by other means in 2020. This is why I think that the government responses have been exaggerated and misplaced. And there are three that I would like to discuss very briefly. The first is the strategy, again, making the headlines very spectacularly over the summer, of sending the Navy for pushbacks to France. Instead, the UK, as a contracting party of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Convention on Search and Rescue, and the Convention on Safety of Life at Sea, should have launched rescue missions to bring persons in need of assistance to a place of safety. So the intermediary tactics, the passive blockades, as Priti Patel has called them, and interdictions back to France are actually illegal. They infringe obligations of the UK under the Law of the Sea and violate human rights. The second strategy of the government has been having recourse to the Dublin regulation, which apportions responsibility among European Union member states to deal with asylum applications, by misusing the rules to return vulnerable applicants, including minors, back to the continent in disregard of their specific circumstances. And this, again, I think is illegal. So Operation Sileth, as it's been called, misuses the Dublin regulation in disregard of key protective clauses, according to which, for example, minors should never be returned unless this is for family reunification purposes and it is demonstrably in the best interest of the child, which would require careful evaluation and detailed scrutiny of each individual case rather than direct repatriation in charter flights, as we've seen in the past weeks. The third strategy, which I think is quite insidious politically, is the branding of lawyers defending asylum seekers as activists, thereby, in my opinion, misrepresenting the rule of law. These lawyers, having recourse to due process, actually are preserving the rule of law and their clients' rights, as well as contributing to ensuring the integrity of the most fundamental pillars of the democratic system that the UK is. So disparaging their intervention as an opportunistic act of activism, I think misrepresents what the rule of law is about. What do I think the Brexit landscape will be after the transition period ends? And with this, I'm going to end. I think it's highly unlikely that the EU will renew cooperation in terms of asylum policy in the way we know it. The Dublin arrangements are going to be discontinued. since these have been favorable to the UK, in that the UK has normally been able to send more unwanted asylum seekers back to EU countries than vice versa. So COVID politics could entrench the dynamic that I've discussed, particularly since the UK will be freed of its EU law obligations. This, however, shouldn't mean that the UK should continue in this pathway, because international human rights law obligations will continue to bind the UK, regardless of EU membership. And this includes duties under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Refugee Convention, or the European Convention on Human Rights, all of which require a change of approach by the government away from the tough touch spectacle politics that I think we've witnessed this summer. So thank you very much. With this, I leave you. I look forward to this.
And in spite of the pessimistic outlook you also gave on the situation and about the rule of law, that was a topic we had yesterday in the conference when, I mean, given the current bill that is in Parliament and the Good Friday agreement also. So I will now move to Susan Oberhauser. She's the head of the European Parliament Liaison Office in London. And I think one of the co-mission of the Parliament is also to keep in touch with EU citizens. So maybe you want to elaborate also on the implications for EU citizens in the UK. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you also Queen Mary's University and the Center for organizing this. This is no mean task in these circumstances. So yeah, free movement obviously is one of the 4 freedoms of the European integration and cooperation. But we have now, as we have heard, the twin storms of COVID and Brexit has placed that in danger in a way. We have also seen here in the UK that the value to live and work across the EU was highly valuable. I mean, as Claude has also said, many of those previously labeled low-skilled workers, the cleaners, the delivery drivers, the seasonal workers, they played a crucial role in the economy in these times. And so without freedom of movement, many of those key workers would not have been here in the EU. So I think that is also something that has to be underlined again. I would also like to speak briefly about that even before the COVID-19 crisis, the protection of the rights of those citizens, of EU citizens here in the UK was laced with uncertainty. I mean, the impact of Brexit and the subsequent establishment of the settlement scheme in March 2019 have caused quite a bit of confusion and anxiety for many EU citizens here. In order to guarantee their continuous rights under the withdrawal agreement, EU citizens must apply for the so-called settled status here, and proving that they have been resident here for a continuous period of 5 years. Now, however, with COVID, it has made it much more difficult for those EU citizens to secure their status and to protect those rights. Those who could not use the online application service were left unable to send their physical documents to the Home Office for almost 2 months. And statistics has shown that the number of the applications to the scheme have dropped from nearly 250,000 in February to a mere 67,000 in April. And the scheme now appears to have fallen to less than half of pre-lockdown capacity. So that is clearly a problem. COVID has also created, obviously, unforeseen and new challenges around the continent. Despite the obstacles, the European Parliament has continuously spoken up for freedom of movement and the defense of those rights for citizens. Parliament has also, in a resolution adopted at the beginning of the year, spoken that any future relationship should also include very ambitious provisions concerning free movement. Now, where that will go, who knows? So, as a background, we we see that the upholding of freedom of movement, whilst navigating in this global pandemic and the social distancing, requires quite a delicate balance. So what we have, the Parliament has therefore at the beginning of the pandemic called on the member states to step up the implementation of EU legislation to regulate different aspects of mobility, such as posting of workers and the social security coordination. And we have also seen that despite those efforts in coordination, some member states took independent steps at the beginning of the crisis to restrict that movement, and in an attempt to mitigate the spread of the virus. Now, Commission has already in March issued guidelines how those categories of posted workers should be able to continue exercising their freedom of movement rights during the pandemic, and at the same time also to coordinate the appropriate health screening to facilitate the free movement of those posted workers. The chair of the Libe committee and the successor to Claude has in an interview recently said that, and here I quote, member state governments have not lived up to their obligations, which are binding. They should have communicated before suspending Schengen with others and the Commission so that the latter can ensure the suspensions are time limited and not discriminatory to some citizens. And he went also on to confirm that freedom of movement, in restoring freedom of movement, the European institutions need to ensure that the mistakes made will actually become lessons learned for the future. So therefore, I think one can sort of summarize that the emphasis from the Commission and the Parliament is now firmly on a coordinated response. The Commission has put forward a package of proposals to guide the gradual reopening of internal borders in the Schengen zone and to enable safe travel to resume. We have also now seen last week the Commission proposal for the safe framework on for measures to be applied for travelers from high-risk areas, and a clear and timely public information about those restrictions that are in place. So in conclusions, I would say that as we grapple with the impact of COVID-19 and the after effects of national lockdowns, this emphasis on coordination amongst member states is crucial, not just in lifting the current restrictions on freedom of movement, but also in guaranteeing that there is no discrimination against the fundamental rights of any EU citizen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susan. And I'm sure that Nicole Sykes has a lot also to react, maybe more from a worker's perspective, economic perspective. When I invited her initially, we were going to speak about the supply chain and how Brexit is going to be transforming that as well. But I think maybe the pandemic has taken another dimension. So Nicole, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the pandemic has had quite the impact on supply chains. I mean, we're talking about freedom of movement today, and to my mind, you can't really extract freedom of movement from freedom for trade. They are interlinked fundamentally at a couple of levels, and I think the pandemic has really shone a light on some of those in an interesting way, and actually in many ways. In many ways more dramatically than we would expect, and in others less so. So if we look, I think, at the impacts the pandemic has had on services trade, for example, services trade has been hit more than any other kind of trade, and services trade absolutely relies upon the movement of people. A substantial amount of that services trade comes from travel-related activities, but also so much of Britain's economy in particular. Britain is a world leader in services trade. Only America does more in volume than us, at least up until now. I'm not sure you can use present tense for any stats anymore. At least up until now, we have been a global leader in services trade, and that all came to a stop. The management consultants who spent 80% of their time traveling, whether that was up and down the country or into Europe or beyond, are at home. And it has fundamentally changed the makeup of the way that we do services trade. Some of that has disappeared, some of that has moved online and become sort of different modes. And while that has ticked over for the present, you do have to ask what it means for the future. A lot of our trade with other countries, whether it's based on services or goods or a mixture of both, does come from the ability to hop abroad, to build relationships, to meet people, and over time develop relationships that lead to sales. It's one of the reasons why there is so much focus on kind of how do we make sure that the conferences that we normally have can be resumed. If you're doing policy conferences like this, yes, you can absolutely do this from a distance, and as you can see, do it pretty well, but you cannot make relationships in the same way, and particularly for businesses, that has been a huge drop. And until we can restore that casual movement across borders to do that, you are going to see sort of opportunity costs being lost because just links and networking won't be forged. The other way, of course, that freedom of movement has been impacted during this period of time is, the lorry drivers and the seafarers who have been physically transporting goods from one area of the world to another. And we did have a period of time there where fundamentally the global transportation system stopped. We had air freight capacity fall by 80%. Here in the UK, a full 50% of our HGVs were parked up for a period of time. So the ones that were still going, some of them were running completely without profit, running at a loss just to maintain ties from one island to another. We had ferry capacity reduced by a similar amount, where ferry companies again were running at a loss just to transport food over, no longer making the income that they would without passengers. 30% of income from freight of ferry companies comes from transporting freight. They missed out on 70% as soon as freedom of movement essentially stopped, because people just weren't traveling. So you did see the situation where our transportation system kind of fell over, or at least halted, and all of the people that were running that transportation system stopped as well. There were lots of debates and lots of kind of last minute policy changes that all different governments had to make when they were saying, okay, you can't come into the country if X, Y, Z. And lots of transportation industries having to lobby and say, actually, we do still need to move our people in and out. They can't be subject to the same quarantine rules because they are needed to deliver these goods, these foods, etc. So you really saw that tied up as well. But obviously the movement of goods wasn't entirely effective. We did see delays in the supply of food into the UK. We did see, absolute nightmares when it came to the movement of pharmaceuticals and medical products as well, with the slamming of export bans around both the EU and individual countries. And that stops the movement of people too. I remember speaking to one pharmaceutical company that was saying, I think it was France at the time, was introducing export bans that were particularly high, and saying, we end up transferring around them. They basically become a country that we can't enter into with our goods because they will get checked, and so we'll just go around them. And suddenly you're having to rewire your networks of systems as well. I think when we're looking at the future, that has a lot of consequences. The future of supply chains is very much under debate right now. And it sticks in ministers' minds, this effect that it's had on food and this effect that it's had on medical products. We do not have a strong pharmaceutical manufacturing industry in the UK anymore. It has reduced in size over the last 10 years by, I think, about 20%. And they now want to increase that. I think they will also be very conscious of the food point with Brexit approaching as well. So you're now having this question, whether or not we want to focus more on growing internally, and what that then means for whether we're moving people abroad as well. So lots of questions about that into the future.
Thank you very much, Nicole. I will, before I welcome our first discussant, Valsalmis Mitsilegas, a word to you, dear audience, about asking questions. So as you know, we will have a Q&A that follows this roundtable. So please start typing your questions in the chat. It's on the right bottom of your screen. And please make sure to say which of the speakers or the discussants your question is for, and add a few words about your affiliation and your status. Our backstage team is going to collect the questions and pass them on to us. So I'm now giving the floor to Valsalmis Mitsilegas from Queen Mary University of London. I'm sure you have a lot to react upon. And again, you have 5 minutes. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a great pleasure to be here. This was a great panel already. I will stick to my time and I will make, I will try to pick 3 common threads from the presentations, focusing on the fact that both Brexit and COVID have actually made us rethink the border. They made us rethink free movement, and they made us rethink citizenship. And I think that the challenge, I think, especially in the European Union, is that this rethinking may lead to fundamental existential challenges on the structure of the European Union and on EU law itself. So I think we need to be very vigilant, and I think we need to give ourselves plenty of opportunities to debate measures that are adopted as emergency measures and measures that are adopted as knee-jerk reactions in a more holistic manner, and to reflect fully on their implications on what we largely take for granted. So the 3 themes, I think, that emerged from the speakers, in my view, that I would like to re-emphasize, if you like, are as follows. The first one is unilateralism against coordination. And this is something I think that we see a lot, both in the current Brexit debate, and I'm not going to say anything more about this. These are interesting times in the UK as we speak, but also in the age of COVID. And that was mentioned by a number of speakers, the fact that the moment we need to react to a perceived existential threat, any form of coordination, even in what is supposed to be an integrated area without internal frontiers, goes out of the window. You know, we have had purely national reactions. We continue to have them, and even reactions that are fragmented in terms of sectors of movement as well. I mean, we have different countries issuing different guidelines on lockdowns and quarantines, you know, tourists. I mean, let alone trade, free movement of services, free movement of workers, students. So, you know, I think it's interesting to see how fragmented this response has been, and how really, I think the European Union has not really been covered in glory in its responses. There are issues of competence, obviously, there, but I think it is striking that really we do not really have much of a common stance or a common strategy. The second element, I think, that really is very prominent is securitization. I think the securitization of the border and securitization of movement. And there, I think COVID has accelerated some very worrying trends. I think in the European Union, we have seen a securitization of the border as regards migrants, asylum seekers, third country nationals. And this is not only, I think, the external border, but it has been increasing to the internal border. I think Mr. Moraes mentioned the growing trend by member states to reintroduce internal border controls masquerading as police or security checks. COVID has accelerated this, and I think we have we need to take a breath on this, and we really need to discuss about whether temporary reintroduction of borders is lawful under EU law, and where the state of emergency stops and where some sort of normality should begin. What is interesting, I think, also in terms of COVID and in terms of this whole discussion about tracking and tracing and apps and so on, and surveillance of mobility, we have really the deployment of parallel trends. For example, the use, the surveillance of mobility under the systems of transfer of PNR, or passenger name records, in order also to play a part within, COVID control. So, we have the blurring of boundaries between security purposes, mobility control purposes, immigration purposes, and we need really to be very vigilant about this. The third and final comment I would make is that both Brexit and COVID responses bring to the fore really a great challenge, which is the proliferation either of borders or of obstacles to movement or obstacles to rights. It is interesting, that we have this discussion about obstacles to rights for EU citizens in the UK, and the challenges I think that we have with Brexit, but we have many more obstacles. I think that, again, it is not really clear how long they will last for. COVID accelerates this, and whether, again, there will be obstacles which will be normalized. And I think we need to think back very carefully about what Schengen means, what Europe is about, and what an area without internal frontiers, an area of freedom, really is. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vassamis. I will now give the floor to Sabine Saureguer, Director of Sciences Po Grenoble. And I think you've worked a lot also on norm contestation in Europe. So we see that through all the presentation, freedom of movement is under contestation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you for the center to organize this conference. I do believe that this is despite our situation, a fantastic opportunity for people all over Europe and all over the world to participate and to contribute to a collective understanding of the situation in which we are in. I would like to make 3 particular comments with regards to the presentations, which I found fantastic and super interesting. The first one is the fact that free movement of people and free movement of goods is, and we all know that, but we forget it all the time, really the cornerstone of European integration. It was thought as bringing people and goods and services together and to create something new out of it. And as Susanne has reminded us, we have now, with Brexit and with COVID, twin storms that question these cornerstones, which are absolutely crucial for us all. And this is, we have seen how many difficulties both these phenomena create for the cornerstone of European integration. The second element that I wanted to underline is that what we also see throughout the 4 presentations is that there is an inherent tension. And this tension has become visible between, on the one hand, the upholding of the freedom of movement. The freedom of movement for all people, not only for European citizens, but for migrants, for all people, because there is a responsibility. And a tension that is created because member state governments must uphold the health safety of their citizens and therefore mitigate the spread of the virus. So they have a double responsibility. The one is to allow free movement and at the same time to protect their citizens from a particular complex health issue. And what I found particularly interesting in the presentations is also to see how unable all of us were, and I include ourselves in that, at the beginning to understand the extent of the COVID crisis. It's relatively easy to say today we should have done this and that. But I think no one in a role of a responsible person somewhere has known in January the effects of this crisis on all of us. It's much easier to say later, well, we should have done this and that, but and until today, what precisely should we do? And I think this tension is fantastically interesting to talk about because it's the basis of our rule of law, of our system, and the question is, do we have to make trade-offs or not? And where are we going? So the decision making is relatively complex. And the third element, and this is more a question for all of us, is we have talked a lot about the regulatory framework and the difficulties member states, institutions had in defining the regulatory framework, in reforming the regulatory framework. So this is one side of it. And the other side is the understanding of the people, of the individuals, and of the collective groups, what they should do or shouldn't do. And what I find very fascinating right now is that there is a huge controversy between different kinds of understanding what a state should do, what the European Union should do. It is a debate that is even stronger than we had before. So I think these three elements are really interesting and to talk about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sabine. Thank you to all of you. We are now going to appear on the screen all together, and we're going to open the Q&A session. And of course, if you have also questions for each other, please keep them in your mind. That might be also useful in the Q&A. So I have a question from one of our PhD students at Queen Mary, Tinahi. And she has a question for Violeta. She says, you mentioned that the Dublin arrangement has been favorable to the UK due to the possibility to send migrants back. But post-Brexit, the UK is unlikely to renew its participation in the Dublin regulation. She has two questions. What impact do you think this will have for migrants and asylum seekers coming to the UK? And second, how will non-participation in the Dublin arrangement in the post-Brexit period impact the UK's migration policy? Maybe to give you also a little bit of time to think about these questions. I don't know if anyone else has a question to one of the panelists, because I do have one actually, and I think it's to build up a little bit on what Sabine concluded on. And I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to have this panel is because I felt freedom of movement was not debated, that there is an absence of politicization of this issue at the moment. And because we are under exceptional circumstances, as you said, Sabine, member states have the duty to protect their citizens. There is the health dimension, but it's completely absent from the debate. Why do you think it is the case? Is it, and maybe I can start asking the question to Sabine, but feel free to step in. Is it a lack also of, is it too politically costly for people to enter into that debate? Because we can also do some policy learning and see that it's possible to restrict freedom of movement in different ways, not necessarily generally, but maybe at regional level. So we see some regional mini Schengen appearing or forming themselves. So why is it not possible to have this debate at the moment? And then maybe to leave the time to Sabine or others to react. Maybe Claude as well could react, because I think these are issues also that could have been debated as well in the Parliament. And Susan, I think I will turn now to Violeta, if you're ready to answer the question. So
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the question. So I have a less optimistic and a more optimistic answer, I think. So the less optimistic would be that the UK would go completely unilateral and keep its understanding of the Save Their Country principle and then declare that France or Belgium or the Netherlands, I mean, from whichever point migrants would have crossed into the UK, are safe countries. And so that would open up a situation whereby these irregular migrants or asylum seekers, as they would normally be, are put in a legal limbo, and you could, detain them for very prolonged periods of time, and you could enter a situation that replicates the Australia style of asylum policy, which is been adjudicated upon by UN treaty bodies as being contrary to human rights. But obviously, I mean, in the UK, you would still have the possibility of recourses to the European Court of Human Rights, and that could temper a little bit that kind of reaction. But I do think that that is really a possibility, particularly if you think about the UK not having a maximum limit to pre-removal detention or to asylum detention. I mean, that's a very real possibility that I think can materialize. So going unilateral, declaring neighbor countries to be safe their countries, and detaining en masse a lot of people while they await removal. The more optimistic possibility is that there are bilateral agreements that are ratified with France and other neighboring countries that entrench through these bilateral channel rules that are similar to the Dublin arrangements, and that could, to a certain extent, palliate the reproduction at EU level, EU-UK level of the Dublin regulation, because I don't think there is any immediate, I don't think in the immediate future the UK will be offered to maintain its status as a Dublin partner outside of Schengen and outside of the Common European Asylum System, and particularly with the situation of the current negotiations for the post-transition period. So thank you. Optimistic or not, I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
Thank you very much. Are you ready, Sabine, maybe to take the floor? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question. It is difficult to give a very clear-cut answer. There are many different variables and aspects that lead us to a situation where this tension occurs, and the tension occurs and seems to be entirely new, despite the fact that we all know that this problem was known before. The fact that a pandemic might occur is not something entirely new. However, it's important to note, and we know that from the study on the terrorist attacks, and in fact today is the day of the terrorist attacks in 2001. But the thing is that we knew that this might happen, but the resources of political actors were just not focused. We know all this idea that there are thousands of problems that float around in the public sphere, and our attention, the attention of a government, can only be on a specific number of those problems. Therefore, a number of actors pushing for these issues. And I think the fact that the pandemic occurred reminded us that the pandemic can occur every day, but the preparation and the resources necessary for the preparation wasn't there. And therefore, the response to, and we have heard that, Schengen, suspending Schengen for a short time, not thinking how to make sure that refugees have a safe place to come to, is something, this is a problem we all knew, but it was secondary compared to other issues. And I think this is a research that should be pushed a little bit more to understand what makes specific problems visible, and where everyone works on it, and in certain times and not in others.
Thank you very much. I see Claude, do you want to react as well? Yes?
Yes, I think, Sarah, you raised this issue about how fundamental free movement really is. And I think Sabine mentioned this as well. And I think we should not lose this very important point, because I think Suzanne mentioned something that we should really note when we talk about the European Union, which is that it's not just one thing. The dominant part of the European Union, which has done the securitization, which Balsamas was talking about, is the member states. They have tried to dominate the debate on Schengen. They've tried to curtail Schengen movement because they have had a debate since 2015, particularly on migration. And what they have done is they've reacted to national electorates. We can go into the debate about this, but they've done that, and they've said, look, for terrorism, security purposes, we will do this to internal borders. We will do it in certain ways. So they've had the Suzanne just mentioned, which has a formal role in this, and it's an increasingly formal role, has been extremely critical. The European Commission has been critical, and the member states are doing it for very, very tough political survival of the European Union. So nobody is in any doubt beyond this that free movement, as we heard, for the economic reasons, social external border, and the internal border checks, if we keep this equation going, we are going to get into deep trouble in the European Union, because if we're going to see a further external border. Violetta is following this, but I don't know exactly how the pact will be. It wasn't in a very good state between the internal checks on Schengen and the external border, and how the pact emerges. Then we're in trouble on Schengen, because this linkage is going to be very problematic for free movement, the economics, the social aspects of free movement, which, as you said, Sarah, are fundamental to the survival of the European Union. One of the big successes of the EU has been free movement, and we should never forget that.
On what we said, and I know, as Sabine said, that we cannot, say what we should have done, but I think there is a possibility with the Freedom of Movement Directive to actually act upon a pandemic. It's Article 29, so I would be curious to know whether that could have been also, or could be in the future, another possibility to activate that instead of suspending or to reintroduce internal border controls. Maybe Valsamis or Violetta might have a reaction. And I have a question. She makes the following comment and question. From what you say, COVID-19 should have had the opposite effect on the UK stance on Brexit from what we currently we see. The start, or the audience, please do type in your last round of questions.
Yeah, I'm trying not to respond to that question in the most cynical way possible. I'm trying to dampen my cynicism, but I mean, ultimately, politics will out. I think we've seen that over the last 5 years. I don't know how many times I have used the phrase that evidence should be used over ideology, but ultimately that has not been consistently our experience. If we were going with, if the UK government, or indeed the UK public, just wanted to go on the economic evidence, we wouldn't be leaving the EU. That has not been our journey, and I think, if anything, it's pushed the UK government, as you say, into a direction of we need to be more independent, and we need to focus on our more critical infrastructure, and we need to redefine what that looks like. And in many ways, that's a much more interventionist approach. So you're actually in this strange place where you have a UK Conservative government who are becoming more and more interventionist. They did so on the labour market in terms of the job retention scheme, and now looking at supply chains and really kind of battling with this idea about picking winners. And it feels like they're quite comfortable doing so when it comes to picking winners in the tech industry, despite the fact that actually the tech industry isn't necessarily one that lends itself very well to picking winners, and frankly doesn't want those winners to be picked, and is very good at winning its own capital. It's looking now at doing so with its health supply chains as well, and that's not necessarily the worst thing, but it's going in that direction. Instead it's saying actually we need to, and you can see why when something that is massively networked falls over, you want to take control. Unfortunately, it does. If you kind of work out a practical example of where are we going to get the oil from that makes that plastic in the first place, You know, there are lots of stages in that supply chain that
Yes, thank you. I'm turning to the panelists if anyone has a final remark or reaction. No? Yeah, I see Violeta.
No, because I thought you had asked a question as well, right? So, I mean, I think, and overall, what these provisions require is cooperation and coordination from early on. It's coordinated by the European Commission at a central level. So the tools were in the treaties, so the unilateral approaches that emerged instead, I think, are in disconformity with the provisions in the treaties. To my mind, what the European Commission should have done is to engage in conversations with the different countries that reintroduced internal border checks and suspended de facto, you know, freedom of movement and sort of destroyed the Schengen system from within. But I don't understand why they didn't, I mean, they didn't decide to not just not launch infringement proceedings, which should normally have been the legal response, right? But I don't know what kind of diplomatic engagements or political conversations they were having with the different countries, but they haven't been effective at all. And then when you look at the external, we are going to double up on our cooperators saying we are going to help people in this conformity with EU legal standards. And the thing is, in the Frontex regulation, there is a mechanism whereby there have to be regular fitness checks of the different sections of the external borders of the EU. And with that information, EU level. And I'm not very sure that any of that has happened in states, but the lack of policing multilateralism has also been characteristic of what we've seen the European Union not doing, because they've intervened too late, I think, and far too little when it's been necessary to you know, like make sure that freedom of movement and Schengen in its integrity would have been preserved. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we will conclude on that note. I think you're giving a lot of food for thought, Violeta, for future reforms. I hope that this exceptionalism. So I would like to thank now all the speakers and the discussants. I think it's been a very interesting roundtable. Thank you for your time.